Hi, my name is Usman. I'm an architectural photographer at Sonder Creative, and today we're looking at three 50 megapixel cameras, two of them medium format. The first one being the Fuji GFX, second Pentax 645z, and the third, my favorite camera to use on a regular basis, the Canon 5DSR. Now all three of these cameras can produce incredible results, especially when you put a good bit of glass in front of them. And for these comparisons, I thought I'd keep things a little bit simple and just use a standard focal length. So on the Canon, it was a Sigma Art 50mm, obviously the 63mm on the Fuji, and the 55mm f2.8 on the Pentax, which has a little bit of a wider angle of view, but it's close enough. Now right off the bat, I just want to say something which probably going to make a lot of Pentax shooters hate me, but this needs to be said. The 645z is hands down the ugliest camera I have ever used in my life. It is definitely the predator of cameras. God, it is so ugly. Pentax has been using this same design for decades now, and God, they need to update it. Some of you might be saying, well, it's not the way it looks, but it's the way it shoots. And no, I mean, we're photographers, aesthetics mean a lot, and oh, it's just so ugly. Someone please, from your design team, just make a better camera. Anyway, rant over. Let's start looking at the results that these cameras can produce. I did a couple of shoots with all three cameras, like I said, just using a 50mm, and the first shoot that I did was fairly straightforward, just a one light setup with Annette. Annette is a model and a photographer, and she's also a writer for fstoppers.com, so check out some of her work, and I'll leave a link below to her website. But I was just photographing her with a one light setup with all three cameras. So the first thing you're going to notice is that the aspect ratios between medium format and full frame is slightly different. Medium format has a slightly more square crop, so it's got a little bit more height, whereas full frame has a little bit more width to it. It's not a major difference, but the reason I'm pointing that out is because it means that the angle of view between both systems is going to be slightly different, even though it's kind of a 50mm lens. Now looking at the images side by side, I've got the Fuji on the left and the Canon on the right, and these have been shot with auto white balance. I made a slight adjustment to the exposures but not the colors, because I just wanted to show you how these cameras interpret the scene. So straight out of the camera, you can see that the Canon has a slightly warmer tone to it, and I'd say it's a little bit more accurate. Personally, I actually prefer the Canon on this particular test because the Fuji has a slight magenta cold shift to it, and the Pentax has a similar kind of color tone. And I mean, you may prefer the Pentax, you may prefer the Fuji. This is not a negative or a positive point on either side. It's just my personal preference. I think that the Canon is doing a better job, and it is actually more accurate. Even when you're looking at the sunlight hitting the building on the back, it's just more accurate and a little bit more pleasing. Also, it has a more cinematic look to it, and it's just more pleasing to the eye, for me anyway. You'll also notice that the depth of field is noticeably shallower on the Sigma because it is an f1.4 lens. However, once you start zooming into the image, this is when the differences really start showing, and the Fuji with the 63mm, even wide open, is incredibly sharp. It produces such beautiful detail, and it's such a joy to look at. The Sigma, however, is noticeably softer compared to the Fuji wide open, and this was quite surprising because I thought the Sigma would hold up really well against the Fuji, but it's not. It just doesn't have that same clarity and crispness, and just doesn't render detail in the same way. The Fuji is just such an incredible lens. Even wide open, it's very surprising how well this one performs. Pentax comes in second, but it is a much older lens, so the fact that it comes in this close and performs this well, even though it's such an old lens, very surprising. Pentax is making some incredible lenses. Sigma does come in last, however, this is just based on the optical performance wide open, and I think that there are a few features that the Sigma does have over the Pentax and the Fuji, and that's mainly down to the fact that it has a wider aperture. And when you take this into a low light scenario, that's when the Sigma really shines, which I did. I took all three cameras out into Leeds, and I was photographing my friend James, and we were just taking a few shots, and the first thing I noticed is that the Sigma is just much better when it comes to focusing. It was just so much easier because of the focus system in the Canon 5DSR for me to find and nail focus and also compose that focus as well. With the Fuji, it was a bit better than I expected. However, I did find a few issues with that. It did hunt quite a bit in those lower light scenarios. The Pentax, on the other hand, was very difficult to focus with. Again, it's an older system, it's an older lens design, so I'm not going to expect too much. I'm not going to give it too much of a hard time, but it was a bit of an issue when it came to nailing focus. The other thing is that when I was shooting at f1.4 on the Sigma, I was able to shoot at between ISO 100 and ISO 200 and get really clean, sharp results. However, with the Pentax and the Fuji, because of that f2.8 aperture, I had to shoot at between 800 and 1000. And because of that difference in the ISO, I was seeing more noise in the Fuji and the Pentax. It might not be a huge amount of noise, but it is noticeably more compared to the Canon 5DSR. Also, looking at these images again, you'll see how the subject isolation is much more pleasing with the Sigma. You've got that much nicer shallow depth of field. The background blur is also a lot more pleasing to look at. The Fuji and the Pentax, although they do have that subject isolation to some degree, it's just not as apparent or not as good as the Sigma. Once again, that wide aperture comes in and it's very useful to have that. Right now, the widest aperture lens that Fuji currently have is f2, which is a great f2. Don't get me wrong, the 110 f2 is a fantastic lens. However, I think that if they did make much wider aperture lenses, then that could be a bit of a game changer, especially for medium format, because we're not seeing any really wide aperture lenses for medium format right now. Now, I did get a chance to do some more control tests between the three systems, and the first test that I did was dynamic range. Now, for this dynamic range test, I did not use the Canon 5DSR purely because the dynamic range in the 5DSR sucks. It really does. So there's no point testing that camera against these two medium format systems because we know that it's going to lose. There's just no way that it can compete. So instead, I cheated a little and used the A7R II because I think people might be interested in seeing that performance versus the Canon 5DSR. And recovering 5 stops of detail on all three systems, the Pentax was the best. It genuinely was. I know that the Pentax has the same sensor as the Fuji, but for some reason it just had slightly less noise and it just protected the details a lot better. The Fuji, you just saw some reduction in the detail that you didn't see in the Pentax, and also there was just a little bit more noise. So this is probably down to the internal processing. The Sony, on the other hand, was much worse. Recovering 5 stops on the Sony, you get this horrible green cast, you get a lot of color noise, and you do get some noise, you do get some luminance noise as well, noticeably more than the Fuji and the Pentax. However, what I did find is that when you add an aggressive amount of color noise reduction on the Sony, you're able to get it pretty close to the Fuji. Not as good as the Pentax, but you are able to close the gap quite effectively between these three cameras. So that is something to note. So you can see over here, when you add a lot of color noise, you still got that little bit of a green cast, which I'm sure you can fix because it's just a matter of adjusting the colors slightly. But the fact that you can get it this close is quite impressive. In any case, Pentax comes first for dynamic range. A close second is Fuji. Sony is third by about a stop, I'd say. I think when you recover 4 stops, you can get away with it. 5 stops is just a little bit too much for the Sony. When it comes to sharpness, for the control test that I did, the Fuji was obviously way ahead of the other two lenses. It's an incredible performer, very sharp, edge to edge, wide open and all the way through the aperture range. The Fuji is just such a good performer. Incredible optics. This lens is just really up there in terms of how well it performs. The Pentax wide open was sharper than the Sigma. However, what I noticed is that when you stop the lenses down, the Pentax doesn't sharpen up as much as the Sigma did. So when you shoot at equivalent apertures, so the Pentax you'll be shooting at about f11, but the Sigma you'll be shooting at f8. So at equivalent apertures, the Sigma was actually sharper compared to the Pentax, but not sharper than the Fuji. So this is something which I found a little bit interesting. So I'd say that when it came to sharpness, I'm gonna give the Fuji obviously first place. The Pentax and the Sigma, however, they're kind of battling it out on second place depending on what aperture you're shooting at. If you're shooting wide open, Pentax wins. However, when you start stopping the lens down, the Sigma starts to become a better option. The thing about the Fuji is that the top screen is an OLED screen and it's such a good screen. Even when you have the camera switched off, as long as you've got a battery which is relatively charged in there, it still gives you information. It tells you things like how many SD cards are in there, how many shots you've got left, and also the battery life as well. This is such a unique and very useful thing to have in a camera, and I think that I wish that more camera manufacturers would implement something like this. OLED screens, seriously, such a good feature. I'd say that the Pentax is hands down the most user-friendly and ergonomic camera I've ever used. It is about as user-friendly as it is ugly. So I think that the design team and Pentax spent their time on the user-friendly aspects of the camera as opposed to the aesthetics, which in hindsight might be a good thing because this camera is such a joy to use. The button placement, the tiltable screen, the fact that it's got two tripod mounts. Everything about this camera has been designed for the working professional, and I really enjoyed shooting with this camera. Just such a joy. The Fuji, on the other hand, did have a few issues in that the viewfinder does have a little bit of lag. Not a major problem, but just bringing it up to my eye, there was a split-second delay, and it might not seem like a major delay, but every time I brought it up to my eye, I just saw this black screen. So I thought, have I switched the camera off? Is the lens cap on? Just that little delay just made me question things, and I'm searching around and realizing, oh wait, no, it's just a delay in the viewfinder. Viewfinder itself is very good in terms of quality, but that little lag is not something I've experienced with my X100F or the X-T2 or any Sony camera that I use with an electronic viewfinder. The Pentax, on the other hand, the thing that I noticed, which I really appreciate and really liked, is the fact that if you've got your lens cap on the front, which I do tend to have on occasions, I'll lift the camera up and like, oh, I got the lens cap on. The Pentax will actually be flashing on the back of the screen, so you know that you've got the lens cap on, or there's a problem or something, or the exposure's too low. So even if the exposure's not correct and you're shooting too dark or too bright, the Pentax will just flash on the back of the screen, giving you an alert telling you maybe you should adjust your settings. And I really appreciated that. Again, usability on the Pentax is just second to none. I think I understand why so many people love shooting with the Pentax. I really did fall in love with the system. Such a good camera. It is ugly, but I'd say it's kind of like a cute ugly, like the dog in Rocky 6. Ultimately, I'm actually finding it difficult deciding between the Pentax and the Fuji because both systems are just so good. The Canon is obviously a really good camera, and it's one that I use on a regular basis anyway. It's my favorite. But I recognize the fact that when it comes to optical performance, dynamic range, and just sheer usability and overall performance, obviously the Fuji and the Pentax are better. In terms of lenses, the Sigma does have certain advantages over the Fuji 63mm and the 55mm. However, the optical performance is what really gives it that edge. If you did want bokeh and shallower depth of field, full frame is still the better option for that really shallow depth of field because you've got much wider aperture lenses available. From a practical standpoint, if I were to decide between all three systems, I would probably go with the Fuji. And the reason I do that is because I can adapt my tilt shift lenses to the Fuji, but I couldn't necessarily do that as well or effectively with the Pentax. I don't even think you can adapt tilt shift lenses to the Pentax, and I do have a video coming where I demonstrate how the Fuji performs with tilt shift lenses and how it performs with other full frame lenses. So if you are interested in that, make sure you're subscribed to my channel, and I'll be releasing that video relatively soon. Also, I just want to give a massive thank you to the Flash Center for helping me make these videos. It's because of them that I'm able to make this comparison and some of the videos that are incoming. If you're interested in more Fuji GFX comparisons and also what the Fuji GFX looks like or how it operates when you put an adapted lens onto it, then please make sure you're subscribed. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you have any comments, suggestions, leave them below. I'll of course try and get back to you as soon as possible, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you.